The void of space stretched endlessly, a black ocean of nothingness, cold and unyielding. Stars twinkled like distant fires far away, indifferent to the struggles of mortals and demigods alike. Within the hull of the strike cruiser Vigilant Fury, the darkness took on a more immediate, pressing form. The corridors were narrow and suffused with the hum of machinery, a constant heartbeat that reminded the crew that they were alive, or at least still alive. The air was thick with recycled oxygen, carrying the faint scent of machine oil, ceramite, and the iron tang of blood from the wounded. The Space Marines moved silently, their steps echoing against the steel walls like distant thunder. They were towering figures, clad in ceramite armor, emblazoned with the sigils of their chapter. Their faces were hidden behind grim helmets, but even under those visors, the weight of what was coming pressed heavily upon them. They were not afraid of dying. Not really. Fear was a distant, meaningless thing for those whose bodies were designed for war, whose minds were trained to obey without question. No, their fear was subtler, sharper, the fear of making the wrong decision, of choosing who should live and who should fall. The captain, a veteran of 100 campaigns, walked with deliberate precision, each step a reminder of his authority. Around him, the squad gathered, silent and tense. Their armor bore scars and burns from previous battles, scratches and dents that told stories of survival, loss, and relentless combat. Each Marine knew the brutal truth in the chaos of war. Not all of them would see the next sunrise. And worse, the decision of who survived might fall on their own shoulders. The chaplain, his robes black as the void itself, raised his voice, echoing in the chamber like a sermon of doom. "Brothers," he intoned, "the time has come to make the decisions that will determine our survival. Not all will make it to the battlefield. The Emperor guides us, but his will manifests through our actions. Choose wisely." No Marine spoke. Words were useless here. Every second spent talking was a second closer to death. The squad turned their attention inward, weighing every variable, every hidden strength and weakness. The youngest among them, barely a decade since augmentation, stood stiffly, his gauntlets clenching and unclenching with nervous energy. He was strong, faster than most, but raw, inexperienced, untested in the horrors of full-scale battle. Across from him, a veteran limped slightly, bearing the weight of countless campaigns on his armored shoulders. Knowledge and experience marked him, but his body had begun to betray him. Could he endure what was coming, or would he fall, dragging others with him? Each Marine carried his own mental ledger, cataloging strengths, weaknesses, injuries, and potential. The corridors were silent except for the hum of life support systems and the occasional metallic clang from a distant maintenance hatch. The silence pressed down on them like a living entity. It was almost sentient, aware of the fear, the dread, the grim calculus that filled the room. The first choice was made quietly, without ceremony. The captain nodded subtly toward the youngest Marine. It was not a punishment. It was not cruelty. It was necessity. A life was chosen, and the Marine accepted it with the stoic calm that had been drilled into him since his earliest days in the chapter's fortress, monastery. His boots clanged against the deck as he walked toward the hatch, the sound ringing in the chamber like a death knell. The others turned their visors away, but inside, their stomachs twisted. Each of them knew that this was only the beginning. The Marine who had been chosen stepped into the cold embrace of the void, tethered only by a thin lifeline. Outside, the blackness stretched endlessly. The enemy could be anywhere, hidden among the stars, waiting. A single misstep, a failed tether, and death would claim him instantly. And the squad watched, silent, as their brother vanished into the darkness. Inside the cruiser, life continued, but it was a fragile illusion. The captain moved among his men, checking armor, scanning internal monitors, observing wounds, both physical and psychological. Survival is not granted by courage alone, he murmured almost to himself. It is a balance of strength, skill, and cold judgment. The Marines understood. They had been trained to follow orders without hesitation, but orders sometimes required them to betray the very essence of brotherhood. Hours passed. The crew moved through the ship like ghosts, shadows among shadows. Emergency lights flickered, casting long, jagged shapes against the walls. The Marines knew that in any real combat scenario, chaos would reign supreme. Decisions that could mean the difference between life and death would need to be made in seconds, with only instinct and training as guides. There was no room for error, no time for second guessing. The sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly through the ship's hull, a reminder that the universe beyond was unforgiving. The Marines prepared themselves, stripping away hesitation, stripping away emotion. But even with all their augmentation, there was a lingering humanity inside each of them, a faint, fragile spark that whispered questions they could not answer. Who deserved to die? Who would survive? How could they justify choosing one brother over another? In a tactical chamber deep within the cruiser, hololithic displays projected scenarios in flickering light. Maps of the battlefield, enemy positions, and projected casualties were analyzed in real time. The captain's hand hovered over the console, adjusting parameters, calculating probabilities. "We can only save some," he muttered. The rest, a sacrifice." His voice was cold, detached, but beneath it, a tremor betrayed the weight of his burden. Every decision carried the weight of 100 lives, every choice a potential massacre. The squad trained silently. Combat drills became a meditation on mortality. Each maneuver, each strike was rehearsed with precision. Yet, the knowledge that any of them could be ordered to fall, to take the place of another in a lethal calculation, gnawed at their minds. Brotherhood was tested not by combat alone, but by the willingness to make these unbearable decisions. One Marine, the sergeant, paused during drills, staring at his gauntleted hands. He remembered the faces of fallen brothers, their screams echoing in the void, their blood painting the walls of forgotten battlefields. Would he be next? And if not, would he be the one to decide who died in his stead? The thought was suffocating. Yet he adjusted his armor and continued. There was no alternative. The Emperor demanded action. Survival required obedience. Night, or what passed for night in a vessel suspended in endless darkness, descended. The hum of the ship became louder in the silence, an almost living entity pressing against the minds of the crew. Dreams were impossible. Rest was a fragile illusion. In the quiet, every Marine wrestled with his conscience. The youngest remembered the nod from the captain, the subtle gesture that marked his fate. The veteran felt the ache of past battles in his joints, knowing that the next decision might fall on him. Each heartbeat was measured, each breath a reminder of fragility in bodies built to endure war itself. A sudden alarm pierced the corridors, a shrill warning of approaching danger. Red lights bathed the metallic walls in an ominous glow. The Marines sprang into action, their movements fluid, practiced, and deadly. Yet even in this rush, the underlying question persisted: who among them would survive the coming assault? Who would be deemed expendable? Who would be sacrificed for the greater mission? The captain made his rounds, his gaze piercing through helmets, through armor, through the hardened exterior of his warriors. "The choice is not cruelty," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow corridors. "It is necessity. Each life weighs against another. The Emperor's will is carried through judgment, not sentiment." The Marines understood. They had been forged in fire and war. They were creatures of discipline, instruments of the chapter's inexorable will. Yet the burden of deciding life or death pressed upon them like gravity itself. As the ship hurtled through the void toward the battlefield, the first casualty of their grim calculus returned. The young Marine chosen earlier stepped back into the chamber, tethered but visibly shaken. His eyes, even behind the helmet, reflected a dawning understanding. Survival came not from strength alone, but from submission to a system where value was measured in potential, utility, and chance. He was alive, but the memory of walking toward the void would linger forever. The others watched silently. Each of them knew that sooner or later, the decision would fall again. One wrong move, one misjudgment, and another brother would be sent into the cold emptiness. The thought was both a warning and a lesson. Life among Space Marines was not glorious. It was brutal, terrifying, and absolute. Each choice carried consequences that could haunt a Marine for decades or centuries. In the quiet moments between drills, between alarms, between battles, the Marines reflected on their existence. They were superhuman, yes, but even superhumanity came with costs. Emotions were suppressed, instincts honed, morality bent to the will of survival. And yet, even in the deepest darkness, a faint whisper persisted, the fear of making the wrong choice, of sending a brother to die, of witnessing the void claim another soul under one's command. The first chapter of their ordeal was ending, but the weight of it would linger. The choice of who lived and who died had been made once, and yet it would be made again, and again, in the infinite expanse of war. The sound of the ship's engines thrummed like a heartbeat, relentless and indifferent, And somewhere in the corridors, in the silent spaces between human and machine, the Marines understood the ultimate truth: in the Emperor's name, even loyalty could become lethal, and survival demanded horrors that would haunt them forever. The void beyond the strike cruiser was a roiling canvas of fire and shadow. The distant stars were swallowed by the glare of planet-side bombardments and tracer fire. The vigilant Fury shuddered as its engines roared against the pull of gravity, sending vibrations through the steel deck that seemed almost alive. The Space Marines had landed, their power armor crunching over the jagged terrain as the ground trembled beneath artillery strikes. Smoke rose in thick, black plumes, cutting off the horizon, and the acrid smell of ozone and burnt metal filled the air. The enemy waited below, in ruined cities and shattered forests, but even the ground itself seemed hostile. Craters yawned wide, rivers of molten slag glimmered with unnatural heat, and corpses, both human and Xenos, littered the battlefield. Every step was a negotiation with death itself. The Space Marines moved with mechanical precision, yet their minds were alive with calculation, assessing every variable, every risk, every life and death decision that could determine the outcome of the battle. The captain led the first squad forward. His boots struck sparks against fractured metal, and his visor glinted red under the burning sky. Around him, his brothers fell into formation, bolters held at the ready, chainswords vibrating with a menacing hum. In this world, hesitation was fatal, and even hesitation in judgment could cost lives. It was here, in the chaos of combat, that the cruel calculus of survival became literal. Enemy fire tore through the air with deafening cracks and shattering explosions. The squad had to advance, yet not all could move together. The narrow corridors of ruined streets forced them into choke points, where each Marine's survival depended on both skill and ruthless prioritization. The first decision arose almost immediately. One Marine faltered under the pressure, his armor dented, systems failing. The enemy fire tore at his flank, and his weapon jammed. The captain assessed him quickly, experience versus potential. Could he make it forward without dragging the squad into a trap? The decision was instantaneous. A nod from the captain, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for nothing, and the others pivoted. The Marine left behind was not abandoned out of cruelty. He was left because the mission could not accommodate hesitation, because even loyalty had limits when the weight of survival pressed down like a gravestone. The fallen Marine fought to cover his retreat, firing a single-handed bolt from his damaged bolter, but the enemy pressed relentlessly. Explosions ripped through the street, sending dust and debris into the air. The smell of ozone and burnt flesh mingled with the scent of scorched metal and the faint trace of machine oil leaking from broken servos. Somewhere, a body fell into a crater, the sound muffled by distance but impossible to ignore. Even the strongest Marine flinched internally. Every life lost was a ripple through the squad, a warning that the battlefield demanded more than courage. It demanded cold judgment. The squad pressed forward. Every corner held the potential for ambush. The air shimmered with energy weapons, the screams of the dying mixed with the growl of bolters. Decisions had to be made on instinct. Who would cover whom? Who would take the lead? Who would hold back? Every Marine was acutely aware that any miscalculation could mean that one of their own would be killed, not by the enemy, necessarily, but by circumstance. And as the firefight intensified, the line between friend and expendable became agonizingly thin. A particularly violent skirmish erupted in the ruins of a collapsed building. Enemy Xenos poured through gaps in walls, claws and energy weapons striking indiscriminately. The captain shouted orders, his voice almost drowned by the cacophony. A Marine in the rear squad hesitated, assessing a flank that could expose them to deadly fire. The hesitation was enough. The enemy struck, tearing through his armor, burning circuitry in his helmet. The captain's gaze swept over him like a blade. Another nod, almost imperceptible. The decision was made. The Marine would be left to fend for himself while the squad pushed forward. Even as the squad advanced, they carried the weight of those left behind. The battlefield was not just a place of physical danger, but a crucible of morality and horror. Every life had value, but every choice also meant sacrifice. The young Marine who had survived the first test during the shipboard selection now saw it magnified 100-fold. Each step forward could be the one that demanded he abandon a brother. Each decision a knife slicing through loyalty, honor, and kinship. The noise of combat was a living thing, pressing against their ears and minds. Explosions carved trenches in the earth, while bolter rounds tore through walls and bodies alike. Smoke filled the air, blinding, suffocating. Shadows moved in the smoke, some human, some not, but the Marines had learned to see beyond the obvious. They knew that survival was not a matter of brute strength alone. It was a matter of observation, calculation, and the willingness to make the unbearable choice to sacrifice a brother if it meant the survival of the many. In a narrow alley, the squad encountered another horrifying scenario. An enemy ambush had been set with traps hidden beneath rubble. One wrong step would mean instant death. The captain gestured, dividing the squad into two teams. One would disarm traps, the other would cover. As the Marines moved, it became clear that only a portion of the squad could make it through safely. The younger, less experienced Marines were now at the forefront. The veteran Marine, scarred from countless battles, took a moment to assess. He could guide them, provide covering fire, but in doing so, he would expose himself to certain death. The choice was immediate. The veteran stepped into the open, drawing fire to himself while the others navigated the traps. Explosions erupted around him, chunks of masonry and metal tearing through the air. He moved with deliberate precision, every gesture designed to protect the younger Marines. And then, a bolt ripped through his armor. He fell, and the squad barely had time to react before the enemy surged. A chilling silence followed, punctuated only by the hiss of energy weapons and the crackle of distant fires. The Marines had survived the ambush, but the cost was clear. The veteran's sacrifice had ensured their survival. The young Marine who had watched him fall felt a hollow weight inside, a mixture of relief and guilt. He had survived, yes, but at the cost of another's life. And that knowledge would stay with him forever. Even amid victory, the battlefield demanded more decisions. Injured comrades cried out for aid, and every choice had consequences. Do you attempt to rescue a wounded brother under heavy fire, risking multiple deaths, or leave him to the mercy of the enemy? The captain's judgment was absolute, and his orders swift. One Marine, tethered to life by barely functioning armor, was left behind under a hail of enemy fire to ensure the squad could advance. The screams echoed in the alley, a grim reminder that survival was never clean, never honorable. It was merely necessary. The squad pushed on, deeper into the ruins, where the enemy's presence was stronger, more coordinated. Here, the calculus of life and death became even more agonizing. One Marine spotted a trapped civilian, clearly alive but vulnerable. The squad could save him, but doing so would expose them to a deadly counterattack. The captain weighed probabilities in a heartbeat and made the decision. The civilian would be left, a casualty of circumstance, while the Marines pressed forward. Each Marine understood the brutal logic: the mission's success outweighed the individual, and sometimes, loyalty to the Emperor required abandoning all else. Night fell, or rather the alien sky darkened, shrouded by smoke and ash. Visibility dropped, but the danger increased. The Marines could feel it in their bones. The enemy was watching, waiting. Every shadow could conceal a lethal strike. Each movement was deliberate, measured, every breath considered. A Marine misstepped, tripped on rubble, and the enemy pounced. The others had to choose: save him and risk death, or press forward. They pressed forward. The fallen Marine would not survive, but the squad's mission depended on their advance. The sound of his fall echoed in the smoke like a drumbeat of inevitability. By the time the squad reached the core of the battlefield, exhaustion had set in. Their armor was scorched and dented, sensors flickering, hearts pumping beneath ceramite that could not fully mask human fatigue. And yet, the worst trials were still ahead. The enemy's forces were concentrated here, and more decisions had to be made. Who would lead the charge? Who would hold back and provide covering fire? Who would be sacrificed for the greater good? The captain turned to his squad, his visor reflecting the fire and smoke around them. "Every life is a weapon," he said, "and every death is a lesson. Choose wisely." The Marines understood the depth of his words. Each choice was permanent, irreversible. In the battlefield of Warhammer 40K, life was not guaranteed, and death was not shameful. It was a tool, a mechanism of survival and strategy. And then, the enemy struck with full force. Explosions ripped the ground, sending debris and bodies into the air. Bolters roared, chainswords tore through armor and flesh alike. The Marines moved as one, but every movement was haunted by the knowledge that any error would mean instant death. One Marine hesitated to fire, unsure of a target obscured by smoke, and the captain's glare alone was enough to steel his resolve. Hesitation would not be tolerated. By the end of the engagement, the squad had survived, but the battlefield was littered with bodies, both enemy and ally. The Marines were not triumphant. They were wary, scarred, and haunted. They had made impossible choices, sacrifices that weighed heavily on their consciences. They had decided who lived and who died, and in doing so, they had embraced the grim truth of their existence. Survival in Warhammer 40K was never glorious. It was brutal, horrifying, and absolute. In the aftermath, the Marines tended to the injured, salvaged weapons, and counted the cost. Every fallen brother, every abandoned soul, was a testament to the harsh calculus that defined their lives. And even as they prepared to move forward, deeper into enemy territory, the haunting knowledge remained. Every step, every decision, every breath could be the one that demanded another sacrifice. In the grim darkness of the far future, life was fleeting, death was constant, and the Space Marines alone carried the weight of deciding who would survive. The battlefield was quieter now, but the silence was not peace, it was anticipation. Smoke still rose from shattered buildings and scorched ground, curling like ghostly fingers into the blackened sky. Fires burned in the distance, consuming what little life remained in the ruined cities. The Marines moved carefully, their armor scarred and singed, their senses heightened. Every footstep, every breath, every flicker of movement could signal death. But it was not just the enemy that determined survival now. The wounds that each Marine carried, visible or hidden beneath ceramite, were the silent arbiters of fate. A torn servo here, a damaged limb there, a hairline fracture invisible beneath reinforced armor, all could become the difference between life and death. The battlefield was no longer only about strategy and firepower. It had become a test of judgment, endurance, and the cruel calculus of sacrifice. The captain's voice cut through the haze, calm but commanding. We move forward in squads, assess the wounded, make the calculations. Time is not our ally. The Marines obeyed instinctively, their training and conditioning sharpening their perceptions. They had learned that hesitation could kill, not just themselves, but their brothers. Every decision had consequences, and every consequence weighed heavily on their conscience. A Marine stumbled into the squad, armor dented, systems failing. His leg servos were damaged, his armor useless weight. He carried a bolter, but it would no longer fire. The captain assessed him with a glance sharper than any blade. The man was brave, loyal, and strong, but in his current state, he could slow the squad, make them vulnerable. The decision had to be made immediately. He would either be assisted, risking multiple deaths, or left to fend for himself. The nod came, subtle but absolute. The Marine's fate was sealed. He did not protest, for he knew the rules of war in the grim darkness of the far future. A squadmate placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of respect and regret, before moving on. The wounded Marine followed at a distance, trying to keep pace, but already he was expendable. Blood ran along the corridors of ruined buildings, mingling with oil, soot, and the acrid stench of melted ceramite. Each step was calculated, each movement a balance between advancing the mission and preserving life. Yet the calculations were not purely mechanical, they were moral, psychological, and horrifying. A single misjudgment could result in the death of multiple Marines, and sometimes a decision could mean choosing which brother would live and which would die. The sound of distant artillery shook the ground. Smoke obscured vision, creating pockets of terror where the enemy could strike unseen. In one alley, a Marine's armor shattered under concentrated fire, exposing the human flesh beneath. He fell to the ground, screaming into his helmet. The squad's medic, a tech Marine with reinforced surgical augmetics, rushed forward, assessing the wound. Time was critical. The man's arm was nearly severed, and his blood loss was severe. A few seconds could determine if he lived or died. The tech Marine's servo, hands moved with mechanical precision, stitching tissues and stabilizing armor systems, but he could not save everyone. He glanced at the squad's captain, waiting for the implicit command that would determine the Marine's fate. The captain's eyes, visible through the red visor, were cold and calculating. There was no sentiment here, only logic, efficiency, and necessity. The decision came swiftly: stabilize him as best as possible, but continue forward. The Marine would survive, but only barely. He would carry the memory of those seconds, the agony of near death forever. Nearby, another Marine had been impaled on jagged rebar. The young initiate screamed in terror, thrashing beneath his own armor's weight. The squad assessed him quickly. Could he be freed without exposing others to deadly fire? Could they extract him and still maintain the mission's momentum? The captain made the choice. One Marine stayed to assist, risking exposure, while the others moved forward, their weapons sweeping the streets. The tech Marine reached down, stabilizing the initiate, but as the enemy advanced, the squad was forced to retreat. The Marine left behind was claimed by the battlefield, a casualty of both circumstance and decision. Every injury, every wound, became a silent test of worth. The strongest, most resilient Marines could endure pain that would cripple an ordinary human, but even they had limits. A fractured limb, a compromised server system, or a malfunctioning life support pod could render a Marine vulnerable. And in this universe, vulnerability meant death. The squad moved with this understanding, eyes scanning constantly, weapons ready, hearts conditioned to suppress instinctive horror. As the battle continued, the squad encountered a cluster of enemy artillery, automated defenses positioned with deadly precision. The captain assessed the situation. Too many Marines were exposed in the open. Casualties were inevitable. He made a calculation in seconds, identifying the Marines who could advance with minimal risk and those who would serve as sacrificial cover. The chosen Marines understood immediately, stepping forward into the line of fire to ensure the survival of the mission. Their bravery was unquestioned, but it was not courage that drove them, it was necessity. The battlefield was a harsh teacher, and it spared no one. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and ozone. Screams echoed in the ruins, some human, some alien. The Marines' ears were protected by layered sensors, but even technology could not shield them from the mental weight of what they witnessed. Every life lost, every scream, became a mental ledger, a reminder that survival demanded cold calculation. The young initiate who had survived the previous ambush now carried the burden of witnessing multiple deaths, learning that valor and loyalty could be instruments of horror. One Marine, heavily armored and decorated with past honors, found himself trapped beneath a fallen beam. His armor had protected him from direct fire, but the weight of the rubble pinned him, crushing his chest and limbs. His squadmates rushed to assist, calculating the risk to themselves. Could they free him without exposing the entire squad to enemy fire? The captain made the decision in an instant. 2 Marines would attempt extraction, while the others provided covering fire. Time stretched impossibly as the tech Marine worked, sweat and oil mixing on his augmetic arms. The extraction succeeded, but not without cost. 1 Marine sustained critical injuries from enemy fire, now added to the list of those whose survival was uncertain. Even as the squad moved forward, the battlefield itself seemed to conspire against them. The ground shifted, trenches collapsed, walls crumbled, environmental hazards became as deadly as the enemy. Each Marine had to constantly evaluate his own capacity, armor integrity, weapon functionality, stamina, and neural augmentation status. A single miscalculation could mean death, not just for the individual, but for those around him. The line between life and death was thinner than a shard of broken ceramite, and every Marine felt it pressing against his consciousness. By mid-battle, the squad had lost several members, some to direct enemy fire, others to calculated decisions made in moments of split-second judgment. Each loss was weighed silently, internally, as the surviving Marines adapted their tactics. Those left were stronger, faster, and more cautious. Their bodies carried the scars of both battle and judgment. Their minds carried the heavier scars of moral compromise. Each decision to leave a brother behind, each choice of who to assist and who to abandon, etched itself into their psyche like fire on steel. The squad approached a collapsed cathedral, now a makeshift fortress for the enemy. Within, screams and movement suggested trapped civilians, enemy combatants, and the remains of previous skirmishes. The captain assessed the options. To storm the cathedral directly would result in certain casualties. To bypass it would leave innocents and enemies alive, potentially threatening future operations. The decision was agonizing. He chose a direct assault, but in his mind, he had already calculated which Marines would take the brunt of enemy defenses, which would likely fall, and which would survive to continue the mission. The assault was brutal. Bolters roared, chainswords carved through reinforced walls, and power fists smashed through enemy ranks. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and the electric tang of discharged weaponry. Marines fell, some to enemy fire, others to environmental hazards. The captain moved like a specter among them, assessing, recalculating, guiding. Each fallen Marine was mourned internally, but the mission demanded progress. Survival was not sentimental, it was pragmatic, terrifying, and absolute. By the end of the cathedral assault, the squad had survived, but at a harrowing cost. Wounded Marines were patched together with augmentics and medica, but some injuries were beyond repair. Others were left behind, tethered by lifelines, as the squad advanced to the next objective. The battlefield had claimed its due, and the Marines were left to confront the grim reality of their role. They were both warriors and arbiters of life and death, their decisions shaping the fate of brothers and innocents alike. Even as they paused to regroup, the weight of judgment remained. Each Marine carried it differently. The young, inexperienced soldiers struggled with guilt. The veterans bore silent stoicism. The captain felt the crushing weight of command. Every decision, every choice of who to save and who to leave behind had been made with precision, but each also left a mark on the soul. In the grim darkness of the far future, wounds were not just physical, they were moral, psychological, and eternal. Every Marine knew that, in the next battle, the cycle would repeat. Every injury would become a factor in decisions of survival. Every life and every death would be weighed and measured. And in that relentless calculus, the Marines understood a terrifying truth in war. The battlefield itself decided who lived and who died, and the only way to survive was to embrace the horror, suppress sentiment, and obey the unyielding logic of necessity. The sun, or what passed for it in the ash-choked sky, began to set, casting long, red shadows over the ruined streets. The Marines gathered, patching wounds, recalibrating armor, and preparing for the next phase of their mission. They were alive, yes, but the scars of their choices, the echoing screams of those left behind, and the weight of judgment would stay with them forever. And even as they moved forward, deeper into enemy territory, the shadow of what they had done, and what they might have to do again, hung over them like a storm cloud, inescapable and relentless. The battlefield was a graveyard of shattered metal, blood, and fire. Smoke hung thick in the air, masking the movements of the enemy and distorting sound into a constant, oppressive hum. The squad moved cautiously, aware that the horrors of war were not only external. Here even loyalty could betray you. Every Marine had faced death before, but nothing prepared them for the betrayal that could come from within. The whispered doubts, the sudden hesitation, the hidden agendas that festered like a cancer among brothers. The captain led the way, his footsteps heavy on the debris-littered ground. His visor reflected the flames that licked at ruined walls, giving him the appearance of a demon wading through hell. Behind him, the squad followed, their movements synchronized but their minds fractured by fatigue, fear, and uncertainty. Even the youngest Marines could feel it, the tension that seeped into their armor, the way glances were exchanged, the subtle shifts in posture that betrayed hidden thoughts. Trust was a fragile commodity, and in this place, it could vanish in an instant. The first sign came from a veteran Marine, scarred across his helmet and armor, who hesitated at a junction. Enemy fire crackled from above, and the squad's sensors picked up motion in the shadows. The veteran's hesitation was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough for the captain to notice. A subtle hand signal, halt, regroup, was all that was needed. The veteran blinked under his visor, a microsecond of doubt flashing across his mind. And then, as the squad moved forward, he subtly shifted position, allowing another Marine to step into the line of fire first. A calculated move, or a subconscious act of survival at the expense of a brother. The squad pressed on, but whispers of doubt began to spread. The young initiate, barely seasoned in real combat, noticed the pattern, though he dared not speak. Every action, every hesitation, every decision had a hidden weight. The captain had taught them that loyalty was absolute, but war stripped away absolutes like paint from steel. Every Marine knew that the next decision might mean choosing between following orders and protecting your own, between survival and morality. A sudden explosion tore through the street ahead. Debris rained down, and the squad was forced to scatter. Amidst the chaos, one Marine's chainsword malfunctioned, sparks flying as he struggled to regain control. Another Marine reached to assist him, but the first's visor reflected something horrifying. The briefest flicker of recognition, a calculated glance, a hesitation that could only mean one thing. Was it fear, survival instinct, or a deliberate choice to let his brother falter so he himself could advance? The thought froze the observer's heart. In the heat of battle, the line between bravery and betrayal was thinner than a hair. They regrouped behind a collapsed wall. The captain surveyed the squad, his gaze sweeping from helmet to helmet. The battlefield was littered with corpses, both human and alien, but he paid attention to the living, watching for signs of failure, weakness, or disloyalty. Even a brief lapse in judgment could result in death, not from the enemy, but from the squad's own ruthless hierarchy. Every Marine had internalized this hesitation could be fatal, not just for oneself, but for those around you. As they advanced, the squad came upon a trapped corridor. Enemy explosives had been set in a complex pattern, and navigating it required precision, skill, and trust. The captain chose a path, assigning Marines to different roles. One Marine, the same veteran who had hesitated earlier, was tasked with leading a delicate section of the maneuver. His hands moved over his bolter, checking systems, but inside, a darker calculation lingered. Could he falter, just enough, to save himself at the expense of another? The thought was abhorrent, yet in this universe, abhorrent thoughts were often survival instincts. The first trap detonated. A Marine was thrown against the wall, armor scorched and twisted. Another caught him just in time, pulling him to safety. The veteran moved forward, perfectly executing his role, but the young initiate couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. Every precision, every calculated move, every hesitation had meaning here, and sometimes the meaning was deadly. Hours passed in a haze of smoke, fire, and blood. The squad advanced into what had once been a civilian district, now a twisted labyrinth of rubble and death. The air reeked of ozone, burned flesh, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Every step was measured, every glance a potential indicator of loyalty or betrayal. The Marines had become hyper-aware, their senses tuned not just to the enemy but to each other. Trust was fragile. Every action could be misinterpreted, every mistake could be fatal. Then it happened. A sudden scream tore through the smoke, followed by the crackle of energy weapons. A Marine had been cut off, trapped in an intersection surrounded by enemy fire. The captain ordered a rescue. 2 Marines moved forward, bolters spitting death, chainswords tearing through the enemy ranks. But the Marine nearest to the trapped brother hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. That fraction was enough. The trapped Marine was hit, screaming as his armor failed. Later, after the firefight, the squad would recount the events and notice subtle signs. The Marine who had hesitated had not been forced. He had had the chance to act, and yet he had held back. Was it fear, self-preservation, or had he made a deliberate choice, a quiet betrayal under the guise of caution? In this universe, the line between morality and survival was blurred beyond recognition. The squad pressed on, deeper into enemy territory, where the ruins were larger, the shadows longer, and the dangers more cunning. The young initiate felt his nerves fraying. He had survived previous battles, but this was different. Every Marine was a potential threat to another, not in malice but as a function of necessity. Decisions had to be made, and sometimes survival required choices that were indistinguishable from betrayal. A sudden ambush erupted in a collapsed plaza. Enemy Xenos leapt from cover, claws and weapons tearing through the air. The squad split to respond, but in the chaos, one Marine found himself isolated. His bolter jammed, and he was forced to fight with only a combat knife. He shouted for aid, but the squad was engaged elsewhere. Moments later, a second Marine reached him, not immediately, but with hesitation that was just enough to ensure he would bear the brunt of the attack. The isolated Marine survived, but not without serious injury. The observer could not tell if the hesitation had been tactical, instinctual, or a subtle act of betrayal. The psychological toll was mounting. Each Marine began to question not only the enemy but each other. A glance, a movement, a delay, all were potential signs of weakness or treachery. Every decision carried weight. The squad had become a microcosm of horror, a crucible of loyalty and fear. The captain, ever vigilant, noticed the subtle shifts in behavior. He had trained for this, not the external battle, but the internal one. The weight of command was immense, for he had to judge not only the enemy, but his own brothers. He observed their decisions under fire, noting hesitation masked as calculation, hesitation that could indicate a flaw, a crack in loyalty. Some would be reassigned, some would be watched closely, and some, he silently acknowledged, might never see the next sunrise if they faltered at the wrong moment. In the labyrinthine streets, the squad came across civilians trapped by enemy fire. One Marine argued to save them, another insisted the mission came first. The captain's judgment was swift. The mission came first. Sacrifices would be made. Some civilians would live, some would die. Every choice mirrored the larger battlefield, where loyalty, morality, and survival intersected in grim, terrifying calculus. The night was suffocating, filled with the crackle of distant fire and the screams of both enemy and ally. Shadows moved unpredictably, and the Marines had to remain alert. One Marine lagged, clearly shaken, his hesitation growing more pronounced. The captain observed quietly. Would this Marine falter again? Could he be trusted? Loyalty was tested not only through words, but through action, through split-second decisions that could claim lives. Suddenly, a squadmate was hit by a concealed blast, thrown across the rubble-strewn street. The Marine cried out, and two others rushed to his aid. One of them, however, paused, not because he could not act, but because he calculated that aiding him would expose himself to certain death. The decision was clear in his mind. The injured Marine might survive, but the rescuer's life was at risk. He acted, but only just enough to stabilize the situation. The battlefield's cruel arithmetic had forced him to weigh loyalty against survival, morality against pragmatism. By dawn, the squad had survived another night of horror, but at immense cost. Marines were wounded, some critically, some had fallen, never to rise again. The psychological scars were deeper than the physical ones. Trust was fractured, fear had been magnified, and the specter of betrayal loomed larger than the enemy itself. Even as they regrouped, the captain reminded them of the harsh truth: loyalty alone did not guarantee survival. The battlefield demanded sacrifice, calculation, and sometimes choices that could haunt a Marine for the rest of his life. Each decision to save or abandon a brother, each hesitation or act of self-preservation, had consequences far beyond the immediate. The young initiate, who had once believed in absolute loyalty, now understood the cruel lesson of war. Sometimes survival required actions indistinguishable from betrayal. Each Marine carried this knowledge silently, like a blade beneath the armor, cutting at conscience and morality alike. The sun rose weakly over the ruins, casting long, blood-red shadows across the battlefield. The Marines moved forward, their armor battered, weapons scorched, and minds haunted. The betrayals, real or imagined, would linger, coloring every glance, every decision, every heartbeat. The battlefield had tested them, broken them, and revealed a terrifying truth: in the grim darkness of the far future, even brothers could be enemies, and survival demanded embracing horrors that could never be forgotten. The battlefield lay in ruins beneath a sky painted with fire and ash. Smoke clung to every surface, curling into the air like the fingers of a vengeful spirit. The wreckage of tanks, shattered walls, and burned-out vehicles formed a chaotic labyrinth, each shadow a potential threat. The screams of the dying had faded, replaced by the constant hum of broken machinery and the distant crackle of lingering gunfire. Yet the danger had not ended. For the Space Marines, survival was not a gift, it was a calculation, an unyielding trial, and now, at the edge of the campaign, it was the ultimate reckoning. The captain moved at the front of the squad, his armor dented and scorched, his voice calm yet resolute through the comms. Around him, the remaining Marines followed, their steps measured, their eyes scanning for threats. The battlefield had claimed much, but it had also revealed the true nature of each Marine: their endurance, their courage, and their capacity for cold judgment. Every life lost, every hesitation, every act of self-preservation had been noted and remembered. The captain knew that, in the final stretch, only the strongest, physically, mentally, and morally, would survive. The squad advanced toward the heart of the ruined city, where the enemy had established a fortified position. Sensors indicated multiple hostiles, entrenched in buildings and beneath rubble, with automated defenses prepared to tear any approach apart. The Marines understood immediately that this final engagement would not merely test their combat skills, it would test their judgment, their loyalty, and their willingness to make impossible choices. A young initiate glanced around, noting the diminished numbers of the squad. He could feel the weight of all that had transpired: the losses, the betrayals, the wounds, the split-second decisions that had shaped their journey. He had survived ambushes, artillery barrages, traps, and even the moral horrors of choosing who lived and who died. But now, as they approached the enemy stronghold, he understood the cruel truth survival demanded: that even the strongest among them might not emerge unscathed, and some would have to be sacrificed for the mission to succeed. The captain gestured toward a narrow corridor leading into the fortified zone. The squad split according to strategy. Some would provide suppressive fire, others would advance and neutralize threats directly. Every Marine understood the stakes. The battlefield had been merciless, and now it demanded the ultimate test. Each choice could be fatal. Each hesitation could doom the mission and their brothers. The first engagement erupted almost immediately. Bolter fire tore through the corridor, chainswords carved through enemy ranks, and explosions sent debris flying. One Marine, heavy armor scorched from prior engagements, faltered under the intensity of enemy fire. The captain noticed the hesitation instantly. In a world where hesitation equaled death, this moment alone would determine his fate. A subtle hand signal redirected him to a more exposed position, ensuring he bore the brunt of the assault. The decision was cold, clinical, and horrifying, but it was necessary. The Marine understood instinctively. The battlefield required it. Chaos consumed the squad. Enemy fire came from every angle, and the sound of bolters and chainswords created a cacophony of destruction. One Marine took a direct hit, his ceramite armor failing, exposing flesh beneath. Another Marine hesitated, calculating whether to risk herself to save him. The captain's gaze swept over them both. Decisions had to be made in seconds. The wounded could be rescued or left. Those who hesitated could be replaced by others who were willing to act decisively. The young initiate stepped forward into the breach, bolter raised, chainsword humming. He had learned from every loss, every betrayal, every agonizing choice. Fear was present, yes, but it was tempered by understanding. Survival required action, not hesitation. He moved with deadly precision, neutralizing threats while remaining acutely aware of the wounded around him. But even he knew that one wrong move, one split-second error, could cost him and his brothers their lives. Deeper into the stronghold, the squad encountered a labyrinth of collapsed buildings and jagged rubble. The enemy had prepared traps, mines, and hidden snipers. Every decision now carried exponentially higher risk. The captain divided the squad again, assigning Marines to high-risk paths. Some would act as bait, drawing enemy fire and clearing paths for others to advance. Others would provide covering fire from exposed positions, knowing that their armor and training might not be enough to save them if the enemy focused fire. A sudden explosion threw a Marine across the corridor. His armor had protected him partially, but his leg was mangled, his movements hampered. Another Marine rushed forward to assist. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. The enemy's sensors had locked onto them. Every movement was life or death. The assisting Marine had to make a split-second decision: continue the rescue and risk being killed, or leave the wounded brother behind to ensure the squad's progress. The decision was agonizing, but the logic of survival prevailed. He assisted just enough to stabilize the Marine and drag him to relative cover, exposing himself to lethal fire in the process. The squad pressed on, navigating the labyrinthine structures. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker of movement could conceal a deadly threat. The Marines' training, instincts, and judgment were tested relentlessly. They had survived ambushes, artillery, moral dilemmas, and physical injuries, but this final stretch demanded perfection. Even the slightest hesitation could unravel everything, and the captain's eyes were everywhere, observing, judging, calculating. At a central plaza, the enemy had gathered its strongest forces. Xenos warriors, heavily armed and relentless, waited behind barricades and makeshift fortifications. The squad's sensors indicated multiple hostiles with advanced weaponry. The captain assessed the situation. A frontal assault would guarantee casualties, potentially fatal ones. Flanking maneuvers were risky but necessary. He allocated Marines according to skill, endurance, and injury status. Those less injured or less psychologically compromised were assigned the most dangerous paths. The wounded, the hesitant, the fatigued, they were assigned to positions where their potential failure would minimize risk to the squad overall. The assault began. Bolters roared, chainswords tore through armor, and grenades erupted in waves of flame. One Marine, already wounded from previous engagements, took a hit that shattered his shoulder armor, sending him crashing into rubble. Another Marine hesitated briefly, calculating whether assisting would put them at risk. The captain observed, silently noting every movement, every hesitation, every decision. Survival demanded ruthless judgment. Some would be saved, others would be sacrificed. The battlefield demanded it. By the end of the engagement, the plaza was a scene of devastation. Enemy combatants lay dead or incapacitated, and the squad had suffered losses. Some Marines had fallen permanently, others were critically injured but still alive. The captain moved among them, checking armor, assessing injuries, and making rapid decisions about who could continue, who needed immediate evacuation, and who was beyond saving. The young initiate, now hardened by countless trials, realized the full horror of their existence. Every Marine carried physical wounds, but the psychological scars were deeper. Every decision, every split second choice, every act of survival at the expense of another left a mark on the soul. He understood now that in the universe of Warhammer 40K, loyalty, courage, and honor were subordinate to the relentless calculus of life and death. Survival was absolute, morality was a luxury. As they advanced toward the final objective, the squad encountered one last obstacle, a heavily fortified bunker, bristling with enemy weapons and defended by elite warriors. The captain assessed the situation. The mission demanded that the bunker be neutralized, but he knew the cost would be high. He allocated positions with surgical precision. Some Marines would provide covering fire, some would breach doors and clear rooms, and others, those who had survived injuries and demonstrated unwavering judgment, would lead the charge. The fallen or critically wounded were assigned supportive roles, where their presence could aid the squad without directly exposing them to lethal fire. The assault was brutal and horrifying. Bolters fired continuously, chainswords devoured enemy ranks, and explosions shook the ground. Marines fell, some permanently, some critically injured. The young initiate saw his brothers, some he had trained alongside for years, fall in ways both heroic and horrifying. The captain's judgment was relentless, each decision precise, calculating who would advance, who would provide cover, who would be sacrificed for the mission. By the time the bunker was cleared, only a fraction of the original squad remained. The survivors were battered, bloodied, and haunted. They had endured every trial the battlefield could impose as ambushes, traps, moral dilemmas, injury, betrayal, and relentless enemy fire. Yet they were alive, and the mission was complete, but the victory was hollow. Every Marine carried the weight of those who had fallen, of those whose survival had been calculated against another's. In the aftermath, the captain addressed the squad. His voice was calm, but it carried the gravity of experience. "You have survived," he said. "But survival is not victory. Every decision we made was necessary. Every life lost was a calculated cost. Remember this always. The universe is unforgiving, and only the strongest endure." The Marines stood in silence, each lost in thought. The battlefield stretched around them, a graveyard of fire, smoke, and shattered bodies. They had made impossible choices. They had chosen who lived and who died, and in doing so, they had embraced the grim reality of their existence in the Emperor's name. Survival demanded horrors that would echo forever in the soul. The young initiate looked at the remaining squad members, understanding now the full scope of what it meant to be a Space Marine. Courage, skill, and loyalty were meaningless without judgment. Mercy was secondary to necessity. Brotherhood was tested not only by combat, but by the unyielding decisions of life and death. Every Marine bore the invisible scars of judgment, the heavy weight of choosing who survives, and the haunting knowledge that, in the universe of Warhammer 40K, only the strong survive, and even the strong are forever haunted by the choices they made to endure. The sun, or what passed for it in the smoke-choked sky, rose weakly, casting long, red shadows across the battlefield. The Marines moved on, their armor battered, weapons scorched, and minds heavy with the memories of horrors witnessed and decisions made. The battlefield had tested them, broken them, and revealed a terrifying truth. Survival was never guaranteed, loyalty could be fatal, and the only way to endure the grim darkness of the far future was to accept that, in war, life and death were tools of strategy, and morality was a weight that could crush even the strongest warrior.